স্যার শ্রেয়সীকে আপনি
হ্যাঁ
অ্যালাউ করুন প্লিজ, ও ঢুকতে পারছে না।
ওর নামটা তো আসছে না। ওকে আরেকবার বলবি একটু
তাহলে আমি
করতে।
বলছি আরেকবার।
হ্যাঁ
স্যার তাহলে আমি স্টার্ট করছি।
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, তুমি start করো।
ওকে।
এটা হচ্ছে না
So
কেন?
yeah, sir.
হ্যাঁ
So good morning, everyone. This is Group 6, and today we'll be presenting some of our findings with regards to the progress in education and its impact on economic growth. The domain of focus while analyzing this correlation is the set of low-income nations, and the dataset for indicators has been sourced from the World Bank open datasets. The variables under consideration here are net enrollment rate, which is the ratio of children of official school age who are enrolled in school to the population of the corresponding official school age. Secondly, the primary completion rate or the gross intake ratio to the last grade of primary education, which is the number of new entrants, the number of students enrolled minus repeaters in the last grade of primary education, regardless of age, divided by the population at the entrance age for the last grade of primary education. Could you move to the next slide, please? Thirdly, we have the share of expenditure on education as a percentage of GDP. General government expenditures on education, current capital and transfers is expressed as a percentage of GDP in this measure. We also have the literacy rate, which is the ratio of the literate population of a specific region consisting of individuals greater than 15 years of age to the total population in a specific region. We initially analyzed the fluctuations of these four parameters over a period of 35 to 40 years and attempt to understand whether there has been a steady increment or a steady decrease with regards to the initial values. In numerous cases, the data range was not entirely sufficient to allow us to extrapolate in terms of underlying trends. The issue was addressed with the aid of interpolation. In ranges where the data was incomplete, the difference between the available values is calculated and divided by the number of vacant intervals to obtain the magnitude of increase/decrease from the initial value. This is invalid for variables which do not demonstrate a truly linear trend in terms of growth. With an analysis of the trends in terms of these educational parameters, we observe firstly that the expenditure share on education has incremented almost steadily in the period between 1999 and 2003, remained moderately stable between 2004 and 7, then fell steeply once again until 2011 before finally incrementing once again until 2017. If we compare the initial and final figures, it has incremented from a 3.02% of GDP from the start of the analysis to 3.78% of GDP from at the end of the analysis. In terms of the trend, in terms of the net enrollment rate, could we move to the next slide? Yeah. The share of individuals enrolled has grown significantly from around 36% in the 1970s to 50% in the 1980s and 90s, and finally fluctuates between 70 and 80% of the population of children in the relevant school age. Next slide. Similarly, in terms of the trends, in terms of of the literacy rates, we have the segment of the adult above 15 years of age population, which possesses the basic cognitive skills as per UNESCO norms, increasing over the years from a base value of around 45.92% in 1988 to around 60.95% in 2019. We need to consider the point that the number of low income nations has shrunk over the last few decades, which indicates significant progress in terms of all of these parameters. However, we are unaware of the cost of education for the medial citizen in these nations and whether they are able to harness the educational infrastructure effectively and whether the children are able to compete in an academic sense with children from more affluent backgrounds in terms of both educational outcomes and assimilation into the job markets. If we next slide please. If we analyze the trends in terms of the primary completion rates, we observe once again that the number of children completing the final year of primary school education has incremented steadily from 1973 onwards, with a moderate slump in the mid 1990s, where it continues to fluctuate at around 40% of the population of children at the entrance age for the final year of primary education, and finally increasing throughout the 2000s and eventually stabilizing at around 64.3% in 2019. While these figures are undoubtedly encouraging and indicate that a vast majority of school going children eventually complete primary education, we are unaware of the data with regards to what proportion of these individuals eventually go on to complete high school education and obtain bachelor's degrees and even go on to pursue graduate education. A very noticeable feature of the data obtained and the trend lines generated is a sudden fall in values during the period of the 1990s. Though quite intriguing, this fall has been explained, or many have sought to explain it, with the interlinkage of this fall to the worldwide economic crisis during the decade of the 90s. During an economic crisis, the slowdown of the economy is associated with reductions in hourly wage rates, numbers of hours worked, and the amount of public and private funds allocated to schools. These conditions obviously affect children's educational outcomes, such as school enrollment, attainment, attendance, and performance. Even though the number of nations in which boys and girls are disadvantaged is similar, there are still nations like Afghanistan with a gender parity index of 0.73. Could you move to the next slide? Yeah. Um, how? Sorry. In the past 2 decades, the global out of school rate has decreased by 7 percentage points, with the largest improvements observed in Western and Central Africa and Eastern and Southern Africa, the low income nations there. Access to education remains highly unequitable in the low income nations in these regions, particularly for vulnerable and marginalized girls, children from the poorest wealth quintile, and children living in conflict areas. More children in Western and Central Africa are not attending school than was the case a decade ago, representing 1 out of 5 children worldwide, which is 20%. High levels of teacher absenteeism and high student teacher ratios at the primary level further add to the teacher workload, and this reduces time on task. This is counterproductive, obviously, because learning gaps developing at the lowest levels are tend to worsen over time. The issue of access to higher education persists in terms of the fact that given the GDP per capita in these low income nations, on average, is bound to be significantly lower than international standards, and the average parent will recognize the trade off between investment in higher education, which will yield returns much later, and the possibility of a child possessing basic education contributing to the family's income stream at that very age. Particularly if the number of family members exceeds 6, this trade off is not a very difficult one, and on average, the after tax income of the majority of individuals in underdeveloped regions in sub Saharan Africa, the Middle East, is not sufficient to finance high school education for more than a couple of children. Abhishek will take over from here.
Next, we talk about next slide, please. Next, we talk about gender disparity in primary completion rates. Gender disparity in primary completion rates usually arise because girls are withdrawn from schools due to prevalent social prejudices, adherence to traditional gender roles, which increases absenteeism and dropout rates, decreasing the probability of completion. There has been decrease in the gender disparity figures over the years due to government schemes and initiatives to increase awareness. As we can see, there has been a decreasing trend in gender disparity in PCR over the years. Primary completion rates have plateaued across the world but are still short of 100%, most notably in low-income countries where it has not improved since 2009. Significant disparities exist in access and learning in relation to wealth, location, and gender. Many education sector plans and policies are blind towards gender. Effective learning is associated with economic growth and has broad benefits. Girls are disadvantaged in 62% of low-income countries, West and Central Africa, and to a lesser extent in East and Southern Africa, and to a lesser extent, East and Southern Africa have a high proportion of countries with disparities against girls. Next slide. Literacy rates are representative of a country's level of human capital. A disparity in the literacy rates between genders indicates a lower value for the average level of human capital in the economy, and thus a lower rate of economic growth. The gradual closing of the gender gap in low income countries therefore leads to better economic prospects in the future. The gender gap is largely due to women's inadequate representation in politics, technical and leadership roles, decrease in women's labor force participation rate, poor healthcare, lagging female to male literacy ratio, and income inequality. The gradual closing of the gender gap for literacy rates in low income countries is necessary for equality, development, and most importantly, economic growth for an economy. Findings from a large literature suggest that gender inequality in education and employment also have significant negative impact on other development goals such as reductions in fertility, child mortality, and undernutrition. Thus, reducing existing gender inequality in education and employment will not only promote growth but also further these other valuable development goals. Next slide. Next, we move to the regression of GDP per capita on PCR. As we can see, the values of the t statistic for the slope coefficient and the intercept term are highly significant, as indicated by the practically zero p values. The positive slope coefficient indicates that there is a positive relation between GDP per capita and PCR. As is observed from the scatter plot and the regression line, there is a fairly linear relationship between the two. Overall, there is a good fit as indicated by the high values of R squared and adjusted R squared. Next slide. Next, we move to the regression of GDP per capita on the literacy rate. Again, the t statistic values for the slope coefficient and intercept term are highly significant as indicated by the practically zero p-values. Here also there is a positive relationship between GDP per capita and literacy rate, which is as expected. Overall, there is a very good fit as indicated by the very high values of R squared and adjusted R squared. Next slide. Finally, we consider the regression of GDP per capita on education expenditure. We expect there to be a positive relationship between GDP per capita and education expenditure, but the scatter plot and the regression results are not consistent with this. The t statistic values are highly insignificant as indicated by the very large p values. The fit is not at all good as indicated by the low values of R squared and adjusted R squared. From the scatter plot also, we see that there is no clear relation between the two variables. Next slide. To conclude, we can say that there is a fairly increasing trend in primary completion rate, literacy rate, and net enrollment rate as is expected. Education expenditure as a percentage of GDP does not display any trend as such. Gender disparity in net enrollment rate, primary completion rate, and literacy rate display a downward trend over the years as is expected. The regression of GDP per capita on primary completion rate and literacy rate reveal a positive relation between GDP per capita and these indicators. However, the regression of GDP per capita on education expenditure does not reveal any such pattern. Thank you.
Okay. Two things. Can you show me the title slide, please? Oh, three. তুমি টাইটেল স্লাইডটা হ্যাঁ ওকে ওটা লো ইনকাম কান্ট্রিজ ছিল না আচ্ছা okay it's a good presentation just two comments one is that I think when Aratrik was presenting he was saying that we don't know that we don't have data on what happened after they became literate or after they completed primary. There's no need to mention these things. If you don't have data, you don't have data. No one is asking you to present it, discuss it. Okay. This is so your approach should be this is my data. I'm able to get these results. What you are not able to show, there's no need to discuss. Achha. The second is, can you go to the regression, please? O3. Yeah. Let's wait over here. Okay. Over here, we are seeing a very good fit. Okay. However, I would say that PCR is not having an effect on GDP per capita. These results don't indicate that PCR is, if PCR goes up, GDP will also go up. Can you tell me why? It's not an easy question for you, but can you just guess why?
Sir, I had a clarification. Does
Yeah.
it have something to do with the the data figures that we have represented, or is it more deeper than that?
It's more deeper than that.
Right.
I won't say it's deeper. It's a very obvious question, but at UG SEM 5, you might not be able to answer it. Okay, I'll give you a hint. Go back to the PCR graph. Yeah, just one. Okay, what are you getting? What is the rough trend? Just in just one word.
Linear.
No. Is it increasing, decreasing, or whatever?
Oh, increasing.
Increasing, right? Acha. If you plot GDP, what will you get? What should the trend show?
Increasing.
Yeah. Because over time, we generally find that GDP is increasing. The rate may be very slow, but it is increasing over time. Now, can you answer the question? Okay. See, what is basically happening if you just look at time series data like this, if you have two variables that are increasing over time, if you plot them, you're simply going to get a positive association, not a causal relationship. Okay. There's a third factor which is causing the change. Time is leading to an increase in primary completion rate. Time is also leading to an increase in GDP. So if you bring them together, what you're getting is what your regressions are showing is the effect of time. Okay, so be careful when you're drawing time series lines. You have to eliminate the impact of time. Okay, otherwise, it's a good presentation. Okay. Can we maybe have the next group, please?
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, yeah.
স্যার বলছি রিপোর্টটা কবে জমা দেবো, মানে কখন জমা দেবো আজকে?
তোমার কোন গ্রুপ ছিল এই গ্রুপটা?
টু 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 টু
So
গ্রুপ
I'm
টু?
presenting the screen.
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, গ্রুপ টু ছিল তোমাদের?
ইয়েস স্যার, আজকে জমা দিতে হবে, মানে কখন জমা দেবো টাইমটা?
হ্যাঁ, রাতের মধ্যে জমা দিয়ে দিও।
ওকে, থ্যাংক ইউ স্যার।
Can we start, sir?
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ,
আমাদের
start
গ্রুপটা
করো।
কি লিভ করে যাবে?
একটু দাঁড়িয়ে যাও, অন্য গ্রুপটা তো ছিল।
ওকে
কতক্ষণ লাগবে? 15 মিনিটে হয়ে যাবে তো।
ওকে স্যার।
Okay, so good morning, everyone. We are Picasso, and today we will talk about trends on education for the middle income countries. So let's talk about the middle income countries first. According to World Bank, middle income countries are defined as economies with gross national income per capita between $10,036 and $12,535. These countries are a diverse group by size, population, and income level, and are home to 75% of the world's population and 62% of the world's poor. These countries also represent about one third of the global GDP and are the major engines of global growth. Now, our objectives for this project was to analyze the trends and progress in education by studying the indicators of education throughout the years. Also, to analyze gender disparities in education and to relate GDP per capita with primary completion rate, literacy rate, and net enrollment rate. So the first trend that we are going to talk about is the trends in literacy rate. It is quite evident from the graph that there is an upward trend without any noticeable dip. The level of literacy shows a marked jump from year 1997 onwards. And this also suggests a slowly approaching of the 100% complete literacy mark. The possible reasons for this could be that there is a growing awareness regarding the long term benefits of literacy. The middle income groups see education as a necessary investment to increment the generational wealth and societal status. Okay, coming to the next indicator. Now, this was interesting. The net enrollment rate. Again, from the graph, we see a general upward trend. However, much disturbances are there over the years. We observe that the dips in the net enrollment rate are consistent with periods of global economic instability. For example, the American fiscal crisis of 1970s and the Asian fiscal financial crisis of 1990s. The reason behind this relationship was that during these times of financial uncertainty, people shifted their emphasis towards consumption with short term goals and cut down on other expenses which did not show immediate result. As we know, net enrollment rate or the rate of merging with the educational framework hence fell due to its long gestation period. So this was an interesting trend of our findings. Now coming to the next trend, the trend in primary completion rate. PCR indicates the educational system's coverage and the educational attainment of students. So, higher PCR indicates that more students who are not of the primary age group are in their last years of primary schooling, reflecting a more comprehensive educational system which applies to a wide group of individuals. Now, observable trend from the graph. There is a steady increase over the years due to increased infrastructural investment and awareness regarding the long-term benefits of education. So again, we see the same relationship as there was in literacy rate also. Now, trends in expenditure on education. Here we faced an issue because there was an unavailability of data, as most of the middle income countries did not disclose education as a separate part of their budget until the late 1990s. So we got the graph like this. However, we can observe a general upward trend as shown in the graph. Now, from here, Shreya will take over.
Thank you, Ritam. So now we move on to gender disparity. We know gender disparity is a social phenomena where men and women are treated unequally, leading to noticeable gaps in various indicators. It arises and is significant when the gap between the males and the females for the same indicator is noticeable and unidirectionally consistent. Education has been long considered to be the forte of males, yet females did not enjoy the same educational access as males did for a long period of time. Only recently, the gender gap has shown a downward trend, implying that both genders are slowly being given equal opportunities. This shows us a sign of economic development and transition into a developing country. Next slide, please. Moving on to gender disparities in literacy rates. This occurs when there is a systematic difference in schooling level between men and women. This is calculated for all indicators by taking the difference of all the indicators for males and females. From the graph, we can see that there is a gradual decrease in gender disparity in literacy rates. Next slide, please. Next, we move on to gender disparities in net enrollment rate and primary completion rate. We see that for middle income countries, the trend for gender disparities show a downward movement. This implies that the gap between males and females are decreasing over time. This means that education is becoming inclusive, which shows a sign of gradual movement towards development and prosperity. Now, Shreyoshi will continue.
Thank you, Shreya. Ritam, can you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. Effects of education on output. Education is one of the most important prerequisites of increased economic growth because as it increases the quality of workers in the population and their productivity also increases and enhances. It is therefore considered to be one of the main indicators of economic growth in GDP. One of the most important indicators of economic growth is considered to be GDP per capita. We regress the various indicators of education on GDP per capita to check whether our original assumption is consistent or not. Next slide, please. Literacy regression. The high value of multiple R squared here means that the GDP is adequately explained by the literacy. Linear trend upward implies that there is an increase in literacy, which would lead to increase in GDP per capita. This is reinforced by the positive slope value of the best fit line or the literacy coefficient. The intercept term is negative, which implies that there needs to be at least a certain level of literacy for GDP per capita to be meaningfully positive. P values of both the intercept and the literacy term are low, which indicate that the parameters are statistically significant. Can we move to the next slide, please? Ritam, the next slide. Thank you. Uh, I think we missed a slide, Ritam. Yeah, thank you. The PCR regression. Multiple R square values are sufficiently high to indicate proper choice of explanatory variable, that is PCR. P values are very close to zero for both intercept and parameters, PCR parameters, which imply that they are statistically significant. Positive PCR coefficient indicates a positive relation between PCR and GDP per capita. As PCR increases, GDP per capita should also increase. Next slide, please. Ritam, next slide, please.
Yeah, I did that.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. For the NER regression, we have R square values, which again indicate adequate explanation of GDP per capita. The intercept term is negative, which means that there is a subsistence level of NER, which is essential for GDP per capita to be positive. The slope coefficient is again positive, which also implies that the relation between NER and GDP per capita is positive. P values are very low, indicating the statistical significance of both the intercept term and the slope. Next slide, please. To conclude, we find out that for middle income countries, trends in education show a significant upward movement. We can see that from the line graphs. The gender disparities in the field of education is decreasing over time across all its indicators, as indicated by the downward sloping trend lines. GDP per capita in particular, or the level of income growth in general, is positively related to the level of education, as evident from the regression. Hence, the middle income countries are moving towards development. Thank you.
Sorry, this is also a good presentation. Just one comment, and this is true for the other presentations also. Can you show any of the regression results, please? Yeah. We generally don't report the multiple R. You're simply taking the square of multiple R to get R square. So report R square. Even adjusted R square is important only if you are changing the number of variables. Okay, so
Okay, sir.
yeah, this is not just about you. I mean, these are things that you are not supposed to know at this stage. The presentation, the objective of the presentation is to tell you what to keep or not to keep. Okay, so just keep the R square, the number of observations, and generally Excel also gives the F statistic. Report that. That is important. Multiple R, don't never report. Adjusted R square, you should report only when you are comparing between two models with different number of variables. Achha. The second point is that you are getting very huge figures. Okay, 5 places of decimal, 6 places. Don't do it. Keep round off to 2 places of decimal. It looks much neater. Second is that when you are drawing the regression, yes, you can see that the coefficient of literacy rate is 232. Okay, can you tell me why it is so high?
Sir, as I
Sir,
mentioned,
sir,
Yeah, follow.
sir, the coefficient of literacy rate is high implies basically the slope of the best fit line is higher, which means that the sensitivity of
Very high
literacy rate.
slope. Now,
Uh, pard- Pardon?
so your 232 implies a very high slope.
Not exactly a very high slope, because if I compare it with the other coefficients, the difference is not very high, but it is high in general.
না এখানে অ্যাকচুয়ালি যেটা হচ্ছে যে তোমার লিটারেসি লেভেলে যে ফিগার্স গুলো, হোয়াট আর দ্য ফিগার্স 87, 97 লাইক দিস।
হ্যাঁ,
জিডিপি পার ক্যাপিটা কত হবে? রাউন্ড অ্যাবাউট 1000।
আচ্ছা, ওটাকে মানে মানে লিটারেসি রেটটা বেসিক্যালি পার্সেন্টেজ টার্মসে আছে, আর জিডিপি পার ক্যাপিটাটা ওই মানে
হ্যাঁ
1000 টার্মসে আছে।
হ্যাঁ, একটা মিসম্যাচ হয়ে যাচ্ছে। এইখানে আমরা অনেক সময় যেটা করি, জিডিপি পার ক্যাপিটাকে আমরা একটা লগ টার্মসে নিয়ে নিই।
হ্যাঁ, জিডিপি পার ক্যাপিটা, আচ্ছা লং টার্মসে।
হ্যাঁ, তাহলে দেখবে যে এই সঙ্গে সঙ্গে দেখবে এই কোএফিসিয়েন্ট গুলো ফল করে যাবে। ঠিক আছে, অনেক সময় আবার তুমি দেখবে যে আমাদের কাছে একজন পিএইচডি করছে, শি ইজ ওয়ার্কিং অন ডিভোর্স রেটস। এবার ডিভোর্স রেটসগুলো না খুব লো ফিগার্স আছে, মানে 0.01, 0.005 এরকম।
তখন পাওয়ারে রেস করে দিতে হবে একটা।
হ্যাঁ, এখানে কি হবে, এটা মানে তোমার কোএফিসিয়েন্ট গুলো ভীষণই কম হয়ে যাবে। এখানে উল্টো প্রবলেমটা হচ্ছে, তোমাদের এখানে ওয়াইটা খুব লার্জ হচ্ছে, এক্সটা কম হচ্ছে, আমাদের এখানে উল্টো হয়ে যাচ্ছে, ওয়াইটা খুব লো হচ্ছে, এক্স গুলো বেশি হয়ে যাচ্ছে, হাই ভ্যালুজ হচ্ছে। তখন ও যেটা করলো, পার্সেন্টেজে বার না করে নাম্বার অফ ডিভোর্সড উইমেন বা 1 লাখ পিপল, তাতেই ফিগারটা বেড়ে গেল। ওকে, এইভাবে একটু ফিগার্স গুলো, মানে ইউ উইল গেট দ্য সেম রেজাল্ট, কিন্তু ফিগার্স গুলো দেখতে একটু ভালো লাগবে। এইগুলো একটু মাথায় রেখো, হ্যাঁ, when you are making presentations. Okay, thank you very much. একটা গ্রুপ আছে না?
না স্যার, এটাই তো লাস্ট গ্রুপ হতে।
আচ্ছা আচ্ছা, 4টে। ঠিক আছে, থ্যাংক ইউ, আই উইল নট টেক মোর অফ ইয়ার টাইম। হ্যাঁ বলো
স্যার